Imagine pressing a self-destruct button, right? But it's completely disguised as the ultimate moral good. Like when we usually talk about democracy, the underlying assumption is, well, it's almost mathematical.
Right, yeah. The logic is basically just, if a system is inherently fair, then more of it has to be better.
Exactly. More voters, more participation, more voices. It feels like this undeniable absolute.
Yeah, it's the absolute bedrock of modern Western political thought. We just generally treat the expansion of the vote as the ultimate, indisputable measure of a society's progress.
Right. But what if, and hear me out, what if that exact mechanism, the relentless expansion of the vote to absolutely everyone, is actually the very thing tearing society apart from the inside?
It's a huge question.
It really is. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are bringing you a deeply provocative, frankly jarring perspective on this exact question. We're looking at a source text from the book 2025 U.S. Launches Correction by Yong Kang.
Yeah, and we are zeroing in on a very specific chapter with a title that, well, it does not pull a single punch. It's called Pure Democracy Ultimately Leads to Tyranny.
I mean, that is a massive claim.
It really is. And our mission for you today is to truly unpack the mechanics of his argument. We're going to trace how the author maps the decline of democratic systems, starting all the way back in ancient Rome.
Right, and tracing that exact same architectural flaw right up to modern America.
Exactly. We're going to explore how he believes universal suffrage and unchecked public opinion don't just cause political friction, but inevitably lead to total societal collapse.
Now, to be completely clear with you listening, we are walking into a minefield of highly charged political commentary today. This touches on both left-wing and right-wing American politics.
Very heavily, yeah.
And we, as your hosts, are completely impartial here. We are taking absolutely zero sides, and we are emphatically not endorsing or validating these viewpoints.
All right, our sole purpose is just to act as your expert guides. We're going to neutrally unpack the mechanics of these arguments so you can, explore the ideas for your own intellectual curiosity.
That is the goal. We are looking at the architecture of the thought process, right? The historical precedents he selects, the causal links he draws, and the ultimate, rather surprising conclusions he arrives at.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the absolute foundation of the author's premise. Because he takes us all the way back to ancient Greece and then specifically focuses on the Roman Empire.
Yeah, he notes that early Rome actually maintained this delicate, highly functioning political framework. It was a structural balance between monarchs, aristocrats, and commoners.
But then he points to a very specific, catastrophic historical turning point, the year AD 212.
Right, the Edict of Caracalla.
Yes.
So this was an edict issued by the Roman Emperor Caracalla that basically granted full Roman citizenship to all free men within the entire empire.
Which is huge, because before this, there were massive provincial status barriers.
Right.
Citizenship was highly restricted.
Very restricted. And according to the author, AD 212 is the exact moment the engine of the empire started to fail.
Because, before that edict, citizenship and the incredibly heavy responsibility of voting on major political affairs, it wasn't just handed out because you happened to be breathing within Rome's borders.
It was earned.
Exactly. You had to bleed for it through military service or earn it through birthright or make these massive, undeniable contributions to the state.
And the author argues that because it required sacrifice, the vote was treated as something sacred. He views this as a psychological shift just as much as a political one.
Oh, totally.
Because when Emperor Caracalla essentially gave citizenship to everyone overnight, and historians often argue he did it literally just to expand the tax base, he stripped away that meritocratic barrier.
It's like, think of a highly exclusive club. Imagine a club where to get in you have to pass rigorous tests, volunteer your time for years, prove your absolute dedication.
Right, you'd respect the club.
Exactly. The members of that club are going to treat the clubhouse with intense reverence. Like if there's a leak in the roof, they fix it. But then one day, management just throws the front doors wide open and says anyone walking down the street is now a member for life.
And suddenly the dynamic changes entirely.
Right. The author's logic is that the membership entirely loses its value. If nobody bled for the clubhouse, nobody cares if it burns down.
That analogy gets right to the core of the author's historical baseline. When you remove the barrier of effort or sacrifice, a sacred duty just devolves into a mere entitlement.
Wow. Yeah.
And he links this dilution of the vote directly to what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, which was this brutal 50-year stretch where the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under civil war, plague, economic ruin.
And for the author, the dilution of civic responsibility was the spark that lit that fire. Which brings us directly to the modern era. Because if 8212 was the historical fracture, well, the author looks at modern American politics and sees a system that has completely shattered.
Yeah. He argues that most democratic countries have reached the inevitable endpoint of this dilution process, which is universal suffrage.
The concept that simply surviving to the legal age of adulthood automatically grants you the right to steer the fate of the nation?
Right, but he argues the United States has actually pushed beyond that endpoint into actively dangerous territory.
Yeah, he gets very specific here. He points to 14 deep blue states, explicitly naming California, which are controlled by Democratic politicians.
And the text focuses heavily on laws passed in these states that prohibit the checking of voter ID during elections.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how directly the author maps the fall of Rome onto these specific modern voting policies.
I mean, it's a bold comparison.
It is. In his view, the Roman Edict in AD 212 removed the barrier of merit. Modern laws that prohibit voter ID checks, he argues, remove the barrier of legality.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he asserts that by banning voter ID checks, the system implicitly allows non-citizens to participate in the electoral process, which he views as the ultimate degradation of a sovereign state.
Wait, hold on. I can't let that slide without pushing back on the core philosophy here.
Yeah.
Because the entire modern world, like the way Western civilization operates today, views voting as a fundamental, undeniable human right.
Yes.
The UN literally defines it as such. So how does the author reconcile this deep belief that voting is a restricted, exclusive privilege with the basic modern consensus of human rights? Like, is he seriously arguing that the global definition of human rights is what's destroying us?
According to the mechanics of his argument, yes.
Really?
Yeah, those two concepts are entirely at odds for him. To the author, framing voting as a universal human right is the exact mechanism that strips it of its necessary weight.
Huh.
If everyone has it by default, regardless of their stake in the system, then nobody feels the heavy responsibility required to wield that power wisely.
Wow.
And a lack of wisdom in a mass electorate leads us directly to his next major structural concern, which is the absolute tyranny of public opinion.
Right, because once we've established who he thinks shouldn't be voting, we have to look at what actually happens when the unchecked masses hold the wheel. And he brings in some major historical thinkers to explain the mechanics of this disaster.
He does. He relies heavily on historical figures who harbored intense skepticism about pure democracy. Like, he quotes the 19th century British historian Thomas Babington Macaulay.
Okay, what did he say?
Macaulay warned that pure democracy inevitably destroys either liberty or civilization itself.
Because of how it functions in densely populated areas, right?
Exactly, yes. Macaulay's mechanism is essentially simple majoritarian theft. He predicted that in cities where the poor vastly outnumber the wealthy, the masses will simply use their numerical advantage at the ballot box to strip the rich of their assets.
They just vote to take the money.
Right. They legally vote to consume the wealth-generating engines of the society. And when that happens, either civilization vanishes into poverty or a powerful military dictator steps in to crush the democracy and restore basic order.
Man. And he also brings in James Fenimore Cooper, referencing his book, The American Democrat.
Yeah.
Cooper's fear was that democracies inherently morph public opinion into something more powerful than actual written law.
Which is terrifying when you think about it.
Totally. And then, of course, there's Alexander Hamilton, who famously described the populace as a chaotic giant beast.
The structural danger they're all pointing to is unchecked power. When shifting public sentiment is allowed to override the cold, structured rule of objective law, you don't get absolute freedom. You get a terrifying new kind of tyranny, where the mob's mood dictates justice.
Right. And the author claims Cooper's prediction is no longer just theory. He says it is actively happening right now.
He does.
He cites a very specific example from the 2024 U.S. election. He knows that several American television hosts attempted to act as fact-checking judges during political broadcasts.
Yeah.
And he uses this as hard proof of unchecked excess, posing a fatal threat to stability and truth. So what does this all mean? I have to pause on this. Why is a television host correcting a politician a symptom of tyranny?
It's a striking connection, for sure, but it makes sense within his framework. The author's logic is that when media figures take it upon themselves to be the ultimate arbiters of truth, acting as judges without any actual legal or constitutional authority, they are perfectly embodying Cooper's fear.
They become the giant beast.
Exactly. They are the giant beast of public opinion exerting power outside of legal structures. They're an unelected narrative setter trying to override objective processes. It's basically the mob wearing a suit.
Wow. Which transitions us perfectly from the political power of this giant beast to its devastating cultural impact.
Yeah.
Because the author argues that this unchecked democratic force doesn't just pass bad laws, it actively mutates our social standards.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is making a really profound philosophical claim about equality here. He argues that democracy relentlessly tries to transform political equality, the idea of one person, one vote, into economic and social equality.
And the primary weapon it uses to enforce this is political correctness.
Right.
He argues that under the guise of political correctness, democracy actually infringes on individual rights and constantly shrinks the space for free speech. The core issue, as he outlines it, is that pure democracy demands social equality as a prerequisite for peace.
Yeah.
And he is very blunt about this.
Yeah.
He asserts that it is fundamentally impossible to elevate everyone in a society to the highest levels of intellect, taste, and refinement.
Since you cannot mass-produce genius or refinement, the only mathematical way to achieve total equality is to drastically lower the ceiling.
You have to bring everyone down.
Yes. You bring the standards of the entire community down to the lowest common denominator.
It makes me think of like grading a massive university lecture hall on a strip curve, right? But the absolute mandate from the dean is that no single student is allowed to feel unequal.
Right.
You can't magically make all 300 students understand astrophysics perfectly. So the only way to achieve perfect equality is to mandate that every single student receives a C.
Exactly.
You inherently punish, stifle, and hide the A students just to enforce a baseline mediocrity.
And the author states explicitly that this enforced leveling destroys what Cooper called the gentlemanly tradition.
Which is the idea of leaders who are supposed to rise above base impulses. Like historically, leaders were supposed to be a firewall against the mob.
Yeah. But to prove this tradition is dead, the author points to the 2019 State of the Union address. You remember when Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi famously tore up the sitting president's speech on camera?
Right. For the author, tearing those pieces of paper isn't just a political stunt. It's the ultimate proof of cultural decay.
He uses that specific moment to show the erosion of restraint. In his view, when the leaders themselves abandon decorum and perform theatrical stunts to appease the passions of their political base, the structural integrity of the civilization is gone.
The firewall has become a cheerleader for the beast.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so if society is enforcing this massive baseline of mediocrity, who is actually holding the clipboard? Like, who enforces that? Because mob rule implies chaos, but enforcement implies a deeply organized system.
That's the tension.
Right. And this leads to a fascinating pivot in the text, introducing the concept of collectivism.
Yeah, he brings in the political theorist Harold Lasky, who defined the coercion of collectivism. Lasky foresaw the arrival of a vast welfare state, which your author specifically ties to the modern platform of the Democratic Party that agrees to provide for all of a citizen's basic needs.
But there's a catch.
A big one. In exchange, it demands strict, unwavering uniformity.
He even highlights Argentine President Javier Milei's stark warning from the 2024 Davos Forum. Milei stood up and warned the world that Western politicians are leading their countries down a reckless path toward collectivism.
Yeah, which he bluntly equated to a road of enslavement.
This raises an important question about the central paradox of modern democracy, as the author sees it. On one hand, you have the illusion of the masses in control. But on the other hand, the actual governance style resembles the top-down, meticulously planned approach of old imperial regimes.
It becomes a society directed by unelected bureaucratic elites, what the author explicitly calls the deep state.
Wait, I need to point out a massive contradiction here for you listening. Think about this. Earlier, we explored how the author views pure democracy as Alexander Hamilton's giant beast, right? This chaotic, unrestrained mob of the poor destroying the rich.
Yeah.
But now, he's saying it's actually a highly planned society, meticulously controlled by deep state bureaucrats. And vote on what time feeding happens.
Sorry.
But they're completely ignoring the fact that the zookeepers still own the cages and are buying the food. How could it be both a chaotic beast and a managed zoo at the same time?
Well, the author bridges that exact gap by introducing the mechanism of materialism. How do the zookeepers control the beast? They feed it endless material comforts. The text argues that deep state elites manage the public by fostering a total obsession with the finite material world.
Oh, wow. It's the modern paradox of scrolling TikTok for 6 hours in a climate-controlled room while your civic institutions crumble around you.
That is the exact dynamic he's pointing to. The elites don't rule through explicit violence or military force. They rule by providing cheap dopamine and material distraction.
Interesting.
The text argues that this materialism stunts the soul and weakens higher human faculties. The public becomes so homogenized, so stripped of diversity and intellectual vitality, that they actually begin to feel ashamed of their own individuality.
He literally says people become satisfied with material things, lose the skills to actually produce them, and eventually consume them like savages.
Yeah.
They willingly walk into enslavement because they are comfortable and terrified of standing out from the sea average of the crowd. That is an incredibly bleak diagnosis of the modern world.
There really is.
I mean, we've traced the fall from Roman glory, the dangers of universal suffrage, the tyranny of public opinion, enforced mediocrity, and now a soulless, materialistic deep state. After painting this apocalyptic decline, does the author offer any actual hope? Does he have a mechanism to save democracy from itself?
He does, and he relies heavily on the French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville to formulate his final antidote.
Okay.
Tocqueville observed that democracy has a hidden fatal flaw. It tends to self-cannibalize. Without an external pressure, it loses its original ideals of freedom and eats itself.
But there's a way out.
Yes. Tocqueville also noted that if a democratic system is grounded properly, it can align with God's will and thrive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the author claims that proponents of pure democracy are fundamentally atheists.
Yeah, he says they completely ignore the sanctity of the law and the spiritual hierarchy established by God. Instead, they reduce the infinite mystery of human life down to a sterile, pseudo-mathematical formula: the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
By reducing human governance to mere utilitarian math, he claims they turn the world into a realm ruled by thieves, where 51% of the people can just vote to take the property of the other 49%.
Exactly. And the author's ultimate conclusion is that the only thing that can save a democratic system from this self-corruption is faith. Specifically, he identifies the people's Christian faith as the ultimate necessary pillar of order.
He argues that pious faith drives a heartfelt internal recognition of laws and customs. Like, without that internal moral belief structure regulating behavior, the populace instantly reverts to Hamilton's giant beast.
You either have an internal moral law or you need an external tyrant to keep order.
It's fascinating that a deeply political and historical argument, spanning Roman edicts, California voter ID laws, and Didos economic forums, ultimately concludes that political survival relies entirely on a very specific spiritual foundation.
It's quite the pivot.
The text literally ends with a wish that every Sunday morning sees families lingering in churches across America, arguing that this is the only way to prevent the system from self-destructing.
It is a profound shift from the secular mechanics of voting to the spiritual prerequisites of freedom. For the author, without a shared moral and religious framework, democracy simply lacks the internal restraint necessary to prevent the masses from voting away their own civilization.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. For everyone listening, let's just briefly recap the mechanics of the journey we just took. We traced the author's argument starting with the Roman Edict of AD 212, which he views as the fatal dilution of the sacred earned vote. We followed that logic into modern controversies over voter ID laws, where legality replaces merit. We examined how the tyranny of public opinion enforces a baseline cultural mediocrity to appease the mob.
Yeah.
We looked at how a bureaucratic deep state controls that mob through numbing materialism. And finally, we arrived at his ultimate conclusion, that a shared religious faith is the only internal safeguard against a democracy cannibalizing itself into tyranny.
It is an expansive, tightly interconnected argument that really challenges the very foundational assumptions most of the Western world holds about democratic governance and human rights.
And as a final reminder to you, our listener,
Yeah.
this deep dive was a strictly impartial exploration of Yong Kang's arguments. Our goal was solely to analyze the mechanics of the text and lay out the author's logic without taking any political sides or endorsing his conclusions.
But before we go, there is a lingering implication in the author's reliance on Tocqueville that is worth deeply considering on your own. If, as the author claims, a democracy will inevitably self-cannibalize without a unifying religious framework, What is the fate of an increasingly secular, multicultural society?
It's a great question.
Can modern secular ethics ever provide that same rigorous pillar of order and shared respect for the law? Or does a democratic system, by its very nature, inherently require a shared spiritual hierarchy to survive the chaotic impulses of its own giant beast?
It brings us right back to the beginning, doesn't it? If the exclusive club of democracy has thrown its doors open to absolutely everyone, what is the glue that keeps the clubhouse from being torn down by its own members? It's a massive question. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, and we'll see you next time.